Hello and welcome to the Seasonality webinar. My name is Patrick Summers. I'm the Vice President of Delivery at 4R Systems, and I will be monitoring this session. This presentation is the 7th webinar in a series of webinars presented by the 4R Systems Client Services team. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on our website following the presentation, along with all of our previously recorded webinar sessions. As a note before we get started, all of the phone lines are currently muted, and they will remain muted throughout the presentation. We will be taking questions via the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen throughout the webinar, and those questions will be answered at the end of the session. We will answer as many questions as possible that time allows. Now, I'd like to introduce you to your presenter, Caitlin Ferguson, Associate Client Manager. Caitlin?
Thank you, Pat. In this presentation, we will cover a variety of topics related to seasonality profiles. First, we will briefly define seasonality and seasonality profiles. Then we will discuss how 4R initially creates both default and custom profiles for clients. And finally, we will examine the basic steps involved in determining which SKUs should be assigned to the best fit profile through the 4R replenishment SKU assignment process. First, we identify candidate SKUs for assignment or reassignment. Then we compute a SKU profile for each assignment or reassignment candidate. Next, we compute the distance of the SKU's profile from each potential target seasonality profile. And finally, we assign the SKU to the closest profile. So let's begin with defining some key terms, the first of which is seasonality. Seasonality refers to periodic fluctuations in certain business areas that occur regularly based on a particular season. A season may refer to a time period related to calendar seasons, such as summer or winter, or to commercial seasons, such as the holiday seasons. For example, a company that sells sunscreen and tanning products within the United States might see sales increase in the summer and then drop in the winter. Not only will these variations affect the amount of inventory associated with the higher sales time period, but larger retailers may also decide to hire temporary workers as a result of the higher demands associated with the holiday season. It's important for 4R to examine these seasonality trends in order to create accurate forecasts when generating reorder points for clients. So now let's look at what is a seasonality profile. A seasonality profile for replenishment is a vector of 52 numbers. Each of the 52 numbers is associated with a week of the year, and the value of each number serves as an index centered around the value of 1.0. The sum of these 52 factors should therefore always be 52, and the average value of the 52 factors should always be 1.0. Each value is used to adjust the seasonal changes in demand for an item. So for this particular seasonality profile example, the items that are set to this profile sell the majority of their annual sales units at the end of the year, as is evident by the higher seasonality factor values during the later weeks. So now let's take a look at how 4R uses seasonality profiles with clients using both default and custom profiles. When we first begin to build seasonality profiles, we have the ability to initially create default profiles. In order to do this, we must first identify the node of hierarchy for calculating these seasonality profiles. Should it be completed at the department level, at the class level, at the subclass level? The level of the hierarchy is determined based on how similarly items sell within each level. So for example, if you have a department level category that was toys, but within this department there were two separate classes, one of which was pool and beach toys and the other was Christmas stocking stuffers, we would advise to create default seasonality profiles at the class level, since there are items with varying sales patterns that all exist within the same overarching department category of toys. So after the category level is determined, the default profile for each node of hierarchy is created. We do this using one cluster or a group of SKUs to match the overall sales trend and typically create one default profile for each department, class, or subclass level. This default profile can then be used for new SKUs rolled out to this hierarchy that would tend to have the same general sales pattern as pre-existing items within the hierarchy. After the basic default profiles have been determined, we also have the ability to create more custom profiles by adjusting the number of clusters used to capture all of the different sales patterns. The more clusters that are used, the more diverse the seasonality profiles will be. So in this slide, you can see a representation of the different seasonality profiles created using 30 clusters. Each of the colored lines represents a different cluster. Our algorithm clusters SKUs based on the similarity of sales throughout the year, and the seasonality profile for each cluster is then computed by determining the ratio of demand in each week to the annual average weekly demand. So once the default and custom profiles have been created, we're ready to move on to the assignment process. There are 4 guided steps that we take when completing the seasonality assignment process, which we will examine further in the coming slides. The first of these steps is to identify the candidate SKUs for assignment or reassignment. Next, we compute the SKU profile for each reassignment candidate, and then we compute the distance of the SKU's profile from each potential target seasonality profile, and finally, we assign the SKU to the closest or best fit profile. So the first step in this seasonality assignment process is identifying the candidate SKUs for assignment. The potential candidate SKUs must have a minimum of 60 weeks of sales history. They must also fulfill a minimum store count threshold. So for example, a SKU must be on hand in at least 10 stores within the chain. And they must also fulfill a minimum weekly sales threshold. So for example, a SKU must sell at least 1 sales unit per week. For SKUs with less than 1 year of sales history, we consider to be immature SKUs, and we have the ability to assign a like SKU to these immature SKUs, which means that the immature SKU will be assigned to the same seasonality profile as the like SKU. Or, as we mentioned previously, the default seasonality profiles can also be used for new SKUs rolled out to this hierarchy. So once the candidate SKUs have been identified, the second step in the seasonality assignment process is creating the SKU-specific profiles. So for each candidate SKU, we first determine the normalized demand dollars for each week of the year. Normalizing the demand means that the demand is stock out corrected, depromoted, and markdown corrected at the store level. We then use this normalized demand to calculate the seasonality factors for that SKU. So each of the 52 seasonality factors, again, correspond to 1 week of the year, and the factor for each week of the year is equal to 52, which is the number of weeks in the yearly time period, multiplied by the normalized demand for that week of the year, and then divided by the summation of the total normalized demand for that time period. So looking at the example on this slide, we've abbreviated the normal 52-week period to a 4-week time period just for ease of explanation. So the seasonality factor for week 1 is equal to 4, which is the total number of weeks in this example time period, multiplied by 40, which is the normalized demand for week 1, divided by 166, which is the summation of the total demand for the 4-week time period, and therefore the seasonality factor for week 1 is equal to 0.96. Using this same methodology for week 2, the seasonality factor for week 2 is equal to 4, which again is the total number of weeks used in this example time period, multiplied by 12, which is the normalized demand for week 2, and divided by 166, which is the summation of the total demand for this 4-week time period. And therefore, the seasonality factor for week 2 is equal to 0.29. So once these seasonality factors are computed for each week within the total time period, the SKU-specific seasonality profile is created. After the seasonality profiles have been created for each SKU, we then compare the SKU profile to existing profiles, such as the ones that were created in the default or custom clustering process that we examined previously. And we then compute the distance of the SKU's profile from each potential target seasonality profile. So here we will examine two different distance measures that can be used to compute the best fit profile for each candidate SKU. The first is the sum of the absolute forecast differences, and the second is the sum of the squared forecast differences. Each of these distance measures can be demand-weighted, meaning that each difference is multiplied by demand for that week of the year. We at 4R use demand-weighted sum of the squared forecast differences, which places an emphasis on profiles that minimize forecast error in high demand periods of the year. So here we will walk through an example where we compare a SKU profile to two potential seasonality profiles using the two different distance measures. The calculated SKU profile is represented in blue, and the question is, which profile is a better fit for the selected SKU? Is it profile 1, which is represented in green, or is it profile 2, represented in red? So the answer is that it depends on the total distance measure. In this example, profile 1, represented in green, is the overall best fit using both the absolute forecast difference and the sum of the squared forecast difference. Profile 2 is a better fit for the first half of the year, and profile 1 is a better fit for the second half of the year. So let's examine why this is. The SKU profile factor for week 1 is 0.1. compared to profile 1, which has a factor of 0.3 in the first week. So the absolute difference between these two factors is 0.2, and the sum of the squared forecast difference would be 0.04. Profile 2 has a factor of 0.25 in the first week, so the absolute difference between this value and the SKU profile factor for week 1 is only 0.15. And the sum of the squared forecast difference would be 0.02. So the lower the difference between the SKU profile and the potential seasonality profile, the better fit the seasonality profile is for that SKU. Since profile 2 has a lower absolute value forecast difference and squared forecast difference in week 1, profile 2 is considered to be a better fit for this week. So using the same calculation method for distance measuring, we can see that seasonality profile 2 has a lower distance measure from the SKU profile for both weeks 1 and 2, while profile 1 has a lower distance measure for weeks 3 and 4. When we're observing the total distance measure for the entire 4-week time period, profile 1 has an absolute forecast difference of 0.9 compared to profile 2 that has an absolute forecast difference of 1.8. The sum of the squared forecast difference for profile 1 is 0.22 compared to profile 2, which has a difference of 1.17. So since profile 1 has a total distance measure that's lower than profile 2, we would consider profile 1 to be the overall best fit. And consequently, we would complete the final step of the seasonality assignment process by assigning this SKU to the closest profile, which in this example is profile 1. After the initial assignment of seasonality profiles is completed for all SKUs, we have the ability to automatically reassign and update these profile recommendations as the sales patterns of SKUs continue to develop and change over time. So this ongoing process allows us to constantly adjust and reconsider new options for the best fit profiles with some of our clients. Each week, our system looks at the history of a SKU and compares it to each available profile. And this SKU can be a candidate for reassignment to a new profile if, one, the new profile has a better fit than the current profile, the improvement is greater than a minimum threshold. So for example, there's at least a 10% improvement benefit from switching from profile A to profile B. The SKU has not been reassigned within the last 4 weeks because we do not want to alter seasonality patterns too frequently. and the SKU has at least 60 weeks of history and therefore is not considered to be a new or immature SKU. So in this example, you can see the original seasonality profile for this SKU was the profile depicted in blue, and the actual SKU profile is represented by the dotted orange line, and the potential reassignment profile candidate is depicted in yellow. So the total distance measure for the new yellow profile is now a more accurate fit for this SKU, so we would recommend reassigning this SKU to the newly suggested profile. So in summary, using seasonality profiles allows 4R to more accurately forecast and anticipate the periodic fluctuations in certain business areas that occur regularly based on a particular season. 4R initially creates both default and custom seasonality profiles, and then uses SKU-specific profiles, or calculates SKU-specific profiles, and then assigns this to the best fit profile by computing the distance of the SKU's profile from each potential target seasonality profile. And 4R continues to assess these SKU profile reassignment opportunities in order to maintain the most accurate forecast. And this concludes our conversation on seasonality and seasonality profiles.
All right, well, thank you very much, Caitlin. What we'd like to do now is to open up for some questions. So by doing so, we're going to keep the lines muted, but as I said, there's a chat box to the right of the webinar on GoToWebinar. If you have any questions, just post those there, and I'll post those to Caitlin. We'll try to answer as many as we can. So now I'll pause for a minute. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat room. Okay, I think we have one question that's been posed, Caitlin. How often do you typically assign or reassign seasonality profiles for a client?
Good question. So the frequency of assigning or reassessing the current profiles really depends on the client. So for some clients, we complete an annual reassessment of both the default profiles that were completed at the department, class, or subclass level, as well as the more custom clustered profiles. So this refresh enables the most recent annual sales history to regenerate seasonality profiles each year. And then we also have the ongoing reassignment assessment tool that was highlighted at the end of the presentation, which reanalyzes and computes the top candidates for reassignment on a weekly basis. So we have the ability to reassess individual SKUs as frequently as every week, but we complete a more extensive seasonality profile refresh for some of our clients once a year.
Well, thank you, Caitlin. Are there any further questions from the audience? If you have some, please do post them in the chat room, please. We're going to hang on for about 10 or 15 more seconds to see if there are any further questions. Okay, if you have any further questions or you think of anything regarding this webinar, this will be posted on the website. Certainly, we're also open to you contacting us directly to pose any further questions. Wait a minute, actually we have one more question that I'll pose to Caitlin here. Caitlin, do you have the ability to create custom profiles for individual SKUs is the question?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. Yes, outside of the clustering process, which we mentioned before, we do have the ability to calculate and apply seasonality factors for either one individual SKU or smaller sets of SKUs to create custom profiles. And then this individual SKU or the smaller sets of SKUs can then manually be assigned to the newly created custom profiles rather than using the distance measure method.
Again, thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you all for attending this webinar. We will have another one coming up next month, which is through our client delivery team. All of these webinars are posted on our website at 4rsystems/webinars. You can see the full schedule as well as those we've done in the past. I'd like to say thank you to everyone for joining and look forward to having you join us in the future on a 4R Systems Educating Retailers to Be More Profitable webinar. Thank you.